So, hello, welcome. I don't know if folks have mics on or if you're just watching and listening. Feel free to let me know as we go forward. I'm Todd Laugen, and I teach at Metro State University, although I'm coming to you from the not so glamorous space of my basement right now. And I'm here to chat with you a little bit about Colorado history and teaching elementary school, especially thinking a little bit about the elementary classroom, middle school classroom, and ways to use somewhat non-traditional primary sources in that kind of context. And you see on the screen now, of course, our important sponsors, Library of Congress, Teaching Primary Sources, specifically the Western region. And a shout out to Keith and Kyle for making this all possible, maintaining our network today. So let me just make sure that I can see chat. If people have comments or questions, I'll try to keep an eye on that as we move forward. So introduce yourself. Let me know if you have specific questions as we kind of move forward. And I generally try to teach this as a discussion, but I know this is a little weird today, so I will probably pause and give folks a chance to comment as makes sense. So as we're kind of starting out here today, I want to go to our next slide and get started thinking a little bit about what stories maps tell. So this is the focus, this is the primary source today, maps. And I want to think just about historical maps, different kinds of topical maps, thematic maps, not just using them as quick outline resources or outline maps as resources for having students label geography, but even to think more broadly about how they tell a kind of history story. So we might start with this first one, this first map from the New Yorker magazine. You can see the date, 1976. And I like this map and I dislike this map. I kind of love it and hate it. I don't know if anyone wants to quickly comment on what strikes you as you look at this map. I would be happy to pause and wait for questions or comments or observations if you have any. Hello, folks. I see folks signing in. Michelle Pearson, hi, and others. Anything strike you guys? And you can comment in the chat if you want about this. Pacific Ocean, yes, prominently. All right. Perspectives seem hierarchical. Yes, good point. Flyover country, exactly. And you can kind of see Canada. Yes, yes, the West is all crammed together. Thank you, Michelle. Absolutely, right? Mixed realistic art. We got distinctive lines occasionally with the Hudson. I can see Russia from here, right? From your window. A shout out to oh God, I'm forgetting her name now all of a sudden. John McCain's running mate, Sarah Palin. How could I forget that? Yes. My internet connection is a little unstable, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn off my photo right now. So let me know that I'm here and talking. So lots of great comments, right? Hudson's almost as big as the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. So I really like this map for kind of these crazy details that you all are identifying, which are really helpful. If I could just have us focus for a second on foreground and kind of background, right? In the foreground, we've got lots of detail, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, people on sidewalks, windows, doors, cars, trucks, lots of activity. It's a happening kind of place. And in the background, we've got the West, right? We've got a New Yorker's view of the West. I don't know if you've met any New Yorkers who have this perspective. I certainly knew one in college, and this was definitely his view of the world. Right? So we have this perspective of the West that is not particularly flattering, but it is interesting to think a little bit about how this tells a story about New York and about the West, right? It tells a much more flattering story of New York and a much less flattering story of the West for its lack of detail. It's just kind of a vague tan with a few mountains, right? This is also somewhat a historic view of America from the European perspective. If you think about colonists settling along the Atlantic coast, British colonists specifically, not Spanish colonists, they have a different perspective. But the British kind of had this view of the West as a wide open kind of space. This was America, right? And the action was on the East Coast, looking to the West. So it's an interesting tool for just thinking a little bit about how maps tell stories, I think. That's sort of my hope with that. And I should note here that this material that I'm highlighting for you today comes from a project that I created with a colleague at Metro State, Meg Frisby. Our project is Colorado History Detectives. You can see the cover of the project here, teaching historical literacy to school-aged readers. And our purpose for this, our focus on this, was to think with you all about how we can investigate interesting questions historically. We wanted to collect some primary sources organized thematically that would encourage you and your students to compare different perspectives, to answer questions creatively, really. Our investigative or inquiry questions are designed to guide the research, to guide the project. And we've provided the resources that can allow for a fairly basic research project, even at the elementary school level. So Kyle is providing the link. It's provided down below too, but if you're curious, you're welcome to kind of follow along there too, because most of these slides are collected from that place. So thinking about Colorado history and fourth grade especially, but also Colorado history in middle school, and it can come up a little bit again. We, in our project, wanted to provide a tool that would help folks do some, interesting map work with Colorado history. And we wanted to think about starting potentially with an outline map like this. Sorry about, I'm jumping ahead there a little bit. Thinking a little bit about where Colorado comes from, why this rectangle, right? We know it as one of the two rectangles in the United States. We in Wyoming are the only two that have clearly defined rectangular borders. And there's not a lot of history that's evident when you first look at that shape. And you can quickly realize that the geographic features, the landscape features, don't line up in any meaningful way with our rectangular borders, right? 4 major rivers originate in Colorado. The border doesn't follow any of them. The Continental Divide runs through roughly a third of, not exactly the middle, but one side of Colorado. And the borders, the political boundaries don't reflect that at all. So it raises an interesting question about where do all these straight lines come from? Do they have a history? Do they reflect history in any way? And I should note, if you are using our website with 3rd or 4th graders, this would be an interesting opportunity to just quickly do the outline mapping work that you need. So everybody knows what Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, right? Labeling those quickly. The major rivers are there. I might have students draw in the South Platte, which is my only complaint with this lovely Arizona Geographic Alliance map. That's missing from this. So if we think a little bit about where that rectangle came from, we can start looking at older maps, like this one from 1846. And I don't expect students, obviously, to be an expert on this map, because when you first look at it, it looks totally weird. It's crazy. Like, where did Colorado go? It was just right there on the last map. Now all of a sudden we've got these weird shapes, green, pink, a little bit of yellow, some tan. And so it's pretty difficult right off to find Colorado, or where Colorado will be in 30 years after this map's creation. So one of the reasons I love this map, though, is that you can build a context with it. It allows for all kinds of interesting questions that we might ask students to just think a little bit about. What might this stuff mean? What might these colors mean? What might this territory mean? And I want to just quickly skip from my PowerPoint here to show you where this map comes from, Library of Congress. A quick shout out to our sponsor and valuable resource. So let me see, whoops, maybe I can't get out quickly. Yes, here we are. So Library of Congress, this is the map on the Library of Congress site. And one of the nice features you can do here that we couldn't do on my PowerPoint, or you can't do on the website that I created with my partner Meg, you can zoom. You can zoom in and out and maintain the level of detail. So Colorado would be kind of right in the middle of this screen, right? And as we zoom in, let me just zoom in one more time, you can begin to see some of the key details that help us find Colorado. We can find some peaks. We know there are mountains in Colorado, and they're labeled in this 1846 map, like Long's Peak and Pike's Peak, both appear. We also have some rivers labeled in here. right? So we can begin to see some of those important geographic features for Colorado. But we can also begin to figure out why these colors are here to distinguish some kind of boundaries, right? We have the pink territory, which is Upper or New California, labeled off to the left, lower left. We have Indian Territory labeled over here to the right. I've highlighted that for us now. Those are important details. We also have Texas labeled down here. And oddly enough, we have a place called Santa Fe, just to the left of the big T, as a part of Texas. And that's pretty weird because we all know Santa Fe is in New Mexico. So this map, I think, the more you look at it, the more questions you can start to ask, like, what was the map maker thinking in creating these different spaces? We can also see above the Texas, this Arapahoe and Cheyenne labeled above this Arkansas River, which is the northern boundary of Texas. This is another interesting aspect of this map. We have some Native Americans identified on this map, some Native peoples, and it seems to be their territory, right? This is Indian territory to some extent. So I'm going to scooch back for a second to the PowerPoint, so I hope you don't lose anybody here. But it's useful, I think, for students to begin asking these kinds of questions, and we provided at least this close-up image of these. And my hope with this project, and Meg's as well, was just that we can start asking kinds of questions that are interesting and that can lead us to other places to find answers. We don't provide all the answers here, but we are trying to ask some questions that can help students begin to form a picture. So we could, for instance, start to think a little bit about the time period in which this map was created, 1846. What else was going on in 1846? Turns out there was a war between the United States and Mexico that was being fought from 1846 to 1848. That might be important. Does that play a role in thinking a little bit about how the map maker drew these territories? We might ask, well, where was Mexico? Where was the US prior to this war? Because it turns out this map is very much like an in-between map, in between life before the war with Mexico and life after the war with Mexico. And I think one of the more interesting features is this big pink splotch, the new or Upper California labeled down in this southwest corner. This was Alta California for Mexico, and yet the map maker has somehow separated it from Mexico, the territory that is to the south, which raises an interesting question. Was this when the US annexed this? Was this when the US was eyeing it? Is this an example of what we might call cartographic imperialism, a map maker wishfully projecting his dreams and goals onto the map that he hopes will be realized on the ground? So a lot of interesting kinds of questions we can ask thinking about this map. So let me switch to a second map that we might even compare to the other one a little bit. This map is called Route to the Colorado Gold Regions. There are fewer landscape details, but we can kind of see off to the left a lot of mountains, and we can see some rivers running. And I'll just provide some advice and note that they're running generally from the left of the screen to the right side, right? They tend to be following that direction because they're running from sort of the Continental Divide toward the Mississippi, right, west-east. But we also have this important couple of details here. We have an overland stage line in black that is an arc at the top of the map, and then we have a proposed route for a Pacific Railroad. So this map seems to be highlighting something else, right? Not political boundaries, not so much native peoples, but it's literally a map that a gold seeker might use to try to get to Colorado, or specifically to the gold regions. And it's labeled the Colorado Gold Regions below, but we don't really see those distinctive rectangular boundaries for Colorado on the map itself. But we do see some important towns beginning to appear, like Denver over on the left of the map. We see the Gregory District created, and we see Colorado City to the south. We see a few important locations for the Colorado Gold Rush. So this map helps tell a story of history. It helps tell a story about migrants coming from the right side of the map or from the east, crossing to the left side, to the west. And typically they're following water routes. the water is important. There aren't railroads, there aren't roads, there aren't highways. There are packed dirt trails that are useful for stagecoaches and horses and even walking, getting across this kind of territory. And if you have to walk, it's going to take some time, you're going to need water. So we can be thinking with students a little bit about these kinds of elements and begin to sketch a picture of the gold rush, which is so important for Colorado's early history. This map, dated 1891, gives us a sense of some of these same territories. If we are looking for Colorado, again, we don't see that distinctive rectangle, but we do see that weird little projection of Texas coming up from the south. We also see what was called Alta California, labeled now 1848. The map maker wanting to distinguish for us that this was territory acquired by the United States in 1848. Over to the right, we have territory presumably gathered up into the United States in 1803. So we can see that the place that we know as Colorado becomes part of the United States at different time periods from this map. One of the interesting aspects to this, I would point out to students, is the title, Territorial Growth. So we talk about territories and we talk about growth. And what does that word growth mean when we think about expansion and maps? It's an interesting kind of metaphor, more of a biology metaphor. Plants grow, humans grow. Do countries grow like plants and people? There's an important kind of suggestion there, isn't there, with that use of the word. So that's an interesting aspect to this that I might want to highlight. Oops, I'm sorry, I think I scooted back when I was trying to pull up the chat. Sorry about that. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting questions we can think a little bit about with students here as we're looking at this particular map as well. So moving on to yet another map, we might think for a second about, this is a map of Colorado. We finally begin to see Colorado appearing. We have the rectangular shape. This map appeared 2 years after Colorado was a state. And we might even begin to ask students, why did the map maker put these different colors within the rectangle that we know as Colorado? Where do those come from? Why do we have counties? What do counties do that the state can't do? And then one of the interesting features of this that we could just begin to talk about at elementary and maybe middle school are all this grid plan, all the rectangles, kind of from the center on to the east or to the right. We have lots of these little grids and rectangles. And that's part of those introduce a more complicated idea for land settlement, Homestead Act, township and range. But it is interesting to think a little bit about how Colorado is becoming a state first by having migrants rushing into the gold regions from our previous map and largely bypassing these places where the little rectangles are located. And the settlement comes later, farmers move in later into these different kinds of rectangles. So that would be an interesting follow-up kind of conversation to have about that. So let me move us over to another map drawn by hand because I don't have a historic one. If anyone finds a historic map with this info, please email me. I'd love to have it. I've been hunting for a while and have not found it. This was a hand-drawn map by a historian from the 1970s. The dates at the bottom, though, say 1820 to 1846. So if we're lining up some of these dates, we know then this map comes before the Mitchell map, before those claims between Texas and Mexico and the US. It also comes before the Gold Rush map. And here we have native peoples identified on this map. Arapaho, Cheyenne, on the right there, Kiowa, Comanche below what is the Arkansas River. We have Bent's Fort, first time that's appeared, although that actually was on the Mitchell map. I didn't highlight it, but you can find Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River on that previous map. And then these other forts. So this raises some interesting questions again, right? Why a map that has Indians and forts? Why are the forts there? What does that mean about settlers in Colorado? Was the army that created these forts were those the first whites to move into Colorado in this region? Or were the forts for other people, like fur traders, for trappers? right? We can begin to kind of ask those kinds of questions. And again, even some basic questions about like, why isn't Denver our capital? Why isn't that on this map? Why are we dating it 1820 to 1846? It tells obviously some important information about Native peoples who called Colorado home at that time. If we contrast that map with this one, we can tell another interesting story, right? This is a map of Indian reservations, special territories created by the United States government for Native peoples. So if we look at Colorado in the upper left, we see very few of those Native peoples anymore. We have to look pretty hard in the lower left corner to see the Ute nation down here, the Ute people, the Southern Utes specifically, in this rectangular line running east-west, right, this rectangular box. The Cheyenne and Arapaho are also on this map, but they're not in Colorado anymore. They're not labeled there. They're labeled down here in what we now know as Oklahoma. So something about Colorado changed in pretty dramatic ways, right? From, if we're thinking about 1846, when Native peoples are the most important label for this map, the most important group inhabiting Colorado, and 1892, now we see the Native peoples are gone largely from Colorado except for the Utes. So that raises some interesting questions, and we might not answer them all today or all on the first lesson, but I think it's worth beginning to sketch that out, right? This is part of the story about these maps and what they tell us about Colorado history. Where does Colorado come from? So that's another goal. This was also from the Library of Congress, I should note. So if anyone has questions about that, that would be a good place to hunt for, lots of these kind of maps, generally speaking, these old maps. That and Denver Public Library, which was the source of the Gold Rush map that we had earlier. And I see folks are sharing in the chat room some other tribal nations map. Yeah, that's another great example. We could compare different maps to tell these kinds of stories. And that really is one of our hopes with Meg and my hoping that historical literacy could be something we could integrate into even elementary school classrooms, which involves more obviously than just reading a textbook and answering questions, but hopefully beginning to think about comparing sources, using primary sources on their own to try to make sense of them, but then to compare them and interpret the stories that they tell. So that's another important sort of goal. So I would note, just in closing my first presentation here, thinking about these resources, we really wanted to create an online, and I should note that this is also free, book that would begin to open the textbook, to ask questions that the textbook doesn't, to begin to think a little bit about interpretation. Often textbooks do a good job of hiding the interpretation. The editors and the authors have made very selective strategic decisions about what to include, what to exclude, whether to tell a story of triumphant progress or a story of tragedy and loss. These are all important themes and aspects of historical thinking that I think even young readers can begin to engage with. So we wanted to create a resource online that would allow folks to do that kind of work, to begin to at least ask these kinds of questions. So we provided the primary sources like I was demonstrating in terms of maps. And we also included in this resource some suggestions for you all as teachers. We don't mean to, I certainly didn't include every possibility there. I know you were creative and will come up with additional options, but we wanted to at least provide some guidelines if you're curious and haven't done this sort of work before, or if you're just curious to see how a couple of egghead historians in academia wanted to organize some primary sources and pose some engaging interpretive questions. We provided some tips and strategies for trying to engage students as authors of history. So I could see students, for instance, looking at just the maps we talked about today, puzzling over those in maybe jigsaw groups, coming back together as a class to talk a little bit about what each map might mean, and then think creatively about how can we tell a story with these maps? Or how could we create our own map of Colorado, maybe on big poster paper, maybe online? What key details would we need in our own map of Colorado that would help tell the story of where Colorado comes from. And again, it's not going to be an encyclopedic, exhaustive map with every historical detail, but I think we could guide students to think creatively about what are the really important elements or peoples or events in Colorado's past that we might be able to capture visually in a kind of illustrated map, right? The rectangle I find a little boring. That's one of my complaints about Colorado, is that, you know, our outline is not particularly exciting, so we'd want to kind of fill in some of the details. And the hope here, again, is that we could reconstruct stories from different perspectives. We would obviously encourage you all to think a little bit about the Native American experience, as well as the Spanish and Mexican American experience, and then the Gold Rush experience, right? We're talking about those converging when Colorado becomes a state. So the maps are designed to just get that conversation going and get started. So let me pause there. If folks have questions or comments, I have the group chat up right now, so I can see if you want to type anything or wade in. Feel free.
One question I might ask, Todd, when before other people start asking is, I know we have a lot of teachers that are out of Colorado on this webinar right now. So
yes,
what might be some ideas for using this same type of material? I noticed like the questions, for example, could be, you know, applied directly to another state.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Right, exactly. Megan and I did want to provide resources for Colorado teachers first off, but we really did also try to create a resource that's useful for teaching about the West. So this work could be done, the same kind of project, our resource, I think, could be used to talk about other states as well. The maps, like you saw, even some of them today, were not specific to Colorado. The other primary sources in the other chapters are not necessarily specific to Colorado. It's really more about the West as a whole. So I suppose we could say Western history detectives. But I also would encourage you, if you're interested, to think a little bit about these kinds of resources in your own state. If state history, I know that often falls into the purview of an elementary school teacher. And so I wanted to provide some opportunities for thinking about how to do even state history. And yeah, I see a comment from Ruth King. Thank you, about Utah. I think Wyoming, bordering states, especially New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Nevada. California is a bigger animal, probably. Yeah, thank you for the comment about Montana too. The different projects, and the next one I'll talk about is cowboys specifically, and those are not unique to Colorado, as we all know. So those are Americans broadly, even, that we could talk about, American experiences we could talk about. So thanks, Kyle. It's a good point. Other questions or comments? Let's see if I can get my video back up here. All right, no questions, no comments. Great. Well, I think we are kind of at about the halfway point. So if it's okay with you all, including Kyle, I could go ahead and just switch over to part 2. Or Kyle, would you rather that we pause for just a minute?
Go ahead and switch over to the one slide with the teaching online thing, and I'll just make a mention.
Yes.
About the form.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me do that. Right here. This one, right?
Yeah. So for those of you who would like the professional development certificate for your participation, here's the link. It's bit.ly/PS teaching online. And the only thing about that is all the letters need to be lowercase